as long as you fed it. And what you would feed it by would be the frequencies of other living things. Now, 570 million years ago, after many races were created within the Silicate Matrix on the Metatronic program, they decided it was time to come and get what they wanted, which was the rest of us, which was the Phantom Matrix first. So there's an interesting thing. The Phantom Matrix axis, if you look at our universal stargates as one Cathara grid, the Phantom Matrix axis came in at a 22.5 degree angle, but was running reverse, but it was a 22.5 degree shift from our vertical axis. The Silicate Matrix was on the other side, 22.5 degree shift. We were right in the middle. So they found a way to barrel through, to use wormhole technology, which is poking holes in the natural template to connect things that aren't supposed to be connected. That's like connecting the artery that runs through your neck to the one that runs through your heart to create a bypass that doesn't belong there. And eventually it collapses because it doesn't work really well, because it's not natural. They created something called the Arimathea wormhole. They used Arimatzus, which was their D11.5 star system planet that had almost made it into, return to Christic template, but fell. They created a wormhole between that through the moon of our, not our moon, but the moon of our D11 gate. Now our D11 gate was Avion. Its moon was called Avalon. They created the wormhole through Avalon and into Phantom, so it made an arc of open frequency. That began the building of something called the cube matrix. The cube matrix is the wonderful creation, the quite brilliant creation of divine science used with an anti-Christos intention. It is a, let's say, created life field. You could compare it to artificial intelligence, really. It's created without a soul because it's disconnected from what you would consider soul. It's disconnected from its connection to source. But it is able to sustain by science. The Metatronic lens is science. This is high science used for perversion. It wasn't originally. A Metatron originally was a good guy. But that changed. And when that changed, a whole new type of creation was brought into being that was never seen. It was literally a beginning point, which is hard to do when time is simultaneous. Wait a minute, what begins first? So obviously somewhere, the potentiality for it existed all along in the creations that Source created when it created the matrix itself. But I think, this is my speculation, maybe when we get all up there and we have the whole thing back, then we may feel differently. I think even Source was a bit surprised at how well that it actually was possible that this could take place. That also implies that if Source knew that that potentiality existed and would therefore probably be explored, it also knew there must be ultimately a healing. And Source did know there would be a healing, because the worst case scenario, even if everything imploded, it was still within itself, within Source. So Source itself was willing to gamble just to see to experience what it could create. Source learns. It's not a static field. From every experience it creates for itself, it learns something new. Except it's already something it already knew. It's very hard to describe direct cognition of simultaneous time and simultaneous space. It may suck some things in until it hits a certain critical mass when this resetting occurs. But there will always be a cosmic cycle of resetting of the divine blueprint, and that ensures that anything that became disharmonic, any black hole systems that were made, will be severed from the original matrix. That gets healed, and the other one has X amount of energy left, however much it managed to siphon, and it will have evolution until it expends its energy, and then it will implode upon itself, and it will become part of the particles, the particae, particae, particum, that make up the dimensional fields. And what will happen then, once it's purged, is like a purification where it clears its own distortions by blowing itself apart. Those units of consciousness returned to innocence will then reassimilate into the original matrix from which they fell. But there will be no memory of the fall or of what they were. We're at a position right now where a cosmic cycle is coming to ending and a beginning. The Metatronic bodies are frightening things in a way, because the races that agreed to participate in order to have short-term immortality in exchange for eternal life, they sentenced themselves to that destiny, the path of Arimathea that was originally intended as a path of evolution, a faster path of evolution back into Christendom, became the path of de-evolution. It became the path of the Metatronic imprint, which has no alternative but to return to source through implosion. Now, there are vast races there at this point, because the evolution has gone for so long. There are many, many races that originally started out as a handful of races of Draconian, Weesadek. Now, Weesadeks were the ones who originally weren't even part of this matrix. They had fallen from another collective and created that black hole system, that ours got hooked into. And the Anu Elohim. All of these races, there's just a small amount of them from the higher density fields, higher dimensional fields, like D11, D10. Once they had made the Metatronic promise, and they had allowed their templates to be recoded, they created spawn. They created more of themselves. They, just like the creator gods, just like Source, created the Ascended Masters, and the Ascended Masters created the Rishi, and the Rishi created the Avatars and the Christos Founders races, and they created us down here. They decided, well, now we've got our own universe. We're masters of the universe now. Now we're God over here. And they began to create and populate their matrix with more and more races that had to feed off other living races in order to sustain their matrix. So at this point, there are many, many races there. And there's a reason in here why there's a lot of people that you can look at things that are Christic and anti-Christic, and you can understand them as part of a larger understanding that Source has, or you can go into blame, and you can call one bad, evil, and it should be destroyed. Or you can understand what it's about and where it fits, and you can perhaps feel for the destiny it chose for itself. So even though you can't allow it to harm you, you can still find love. How horrific the things are that it might have done. The races of Phantom Matrix, once they became combined with the Weesadek Matrix, became a force of what, on this planet and many others, is known as the Antichrist. It is a collective, it's not just a singular. But imagine if you were a being. Now imagine if you were a being that you didn't have a lot of memory of where you came from, because they don't give their own memory of where they came from. What if you knew that your only destiny was implosion, unless you tapped into other systems? What if you knew that ascension was no longer even a possibility for you? That the only way you could go home and be healed to go back to where you came from was to do it in total innocence, like a child, with no knowing whatsoever, because you'd go back in pieces. There's a terror in that feeling, the terror of annihilation. That great, my parts might go back, but I'm not going to know it. There's a feeling of being finite. And if you look around at the world we're in today, you can see the huge effect that these races have had once they begin to blend with the races here. Because most of our dogmas, we talked about earlier, the religious dogmas, even the science dogmas, are all coming from that place. They're all coming from a place where ascension really isn't an option. Survival of the fittest is one of the things that happens when a race realizes it's finite. And the only way it can sustain and not implode and not be blown back to space dust is to take energy from something else. It will. unless it has enough D12, which it wouldn't be in that predicament if it did. If it had D12, it would realize, get it over with. Let me go back to space dust, because then I can get out of here. Then I can get free again. They can be free. It will be a long evolution for them, but they would go back into as the basic consciousness that forms the matrix they originally fell out of. And they would eventually be able to be renewed through new forms that would be created in that matrix. But the races that agreed to participate in order to have short-term immortality in exchange for eternal life, they sentenced themselves to that destiny, the path of Arimathea that was originally intended as a path of evolution, a faster path of evolution back into Christendom, became the path of de-evolution. It became the path of the Metatronic imprint, which has no alternative but to return to source through implosion. Now, there are vast races there at this point, because the evolution has gone for so long. There are many, many races that originally started out as a handful of races of Draconian, Weesadek. Now, Weesadeks were the ones who originally weren't even part of this matrix. They had fallen from another collective and created that black hole system, that ours got hooked into. And the Anu Elohim. All of these races, there's just a small amount of them from the higher density fields, the higher dimensional fields, like D11, D10. Once they had made the Metatronic promise, and they had allowed their templates to be recoded, they created spawn. They created more of themselves. They, just like the creator gods, just like Source, created the Ascended Masters, and the Ascended Masters created the Rishi, and the Rishi created the Avatars and the Christos Founders races, and they created us down here. They decided, well, now we've got our own universe. We're masters of the universe now. Now we're God over here. And they began to create and populate their matrix with more and more races that had to feed off other living races in order to sustain their matrix. So at this point, there are many, many races there. And there's a reason in here why there's a lot of people that you can look at things that are Christic and anti-Christic, and you can understand them as part of a larger understanding that Source has, or you can go into blame, and you can call one bad, evil, and it should be destroyed. Or you can understand what it's about and where it fits, and you can perhaps feel for the destiny it chose for itself. So even though you can't allow it to harm you, you can still find love, no matter how horrific the things are that it might have done. The races of Phantom Matrix, once they became combined with the Weesadek Matrix, became a force of what, on this planet and many others, is known as the Antichrist. It is a collective, it's not just a singular. But imagine if you were a being. Now imagine if you were a being that you didn't have a lot of memory of where you came from, because they don't give their own memory of where they came from. You were living in planetary systems. What if you found out that your only destiny was implosion, unless you tapped into other systems? What if you knew that ascension was no longer even a possibility for you? That the only way you could go home and be healed to go back to where you came from was to do it in total innocence, like a child, with no knowing whatsoever, because you'd go back in pieces. There's a terror in that feeling, the terror of annihilation. That great, my parts might go back, but I'm not going to know it. There's a feeling of being finite. And if you look around at the world we're in today, you can see the huge effect that these races have had once they begin to blend with the races here. Because most of our dogmas that we talked about earlier, the religious dogmas, even the science dogmas, are all coming from that place. They're all coming from a place where ascension really isn't an option. Survival of the fittest is one of the things that happens when a race realizes it's finite, and the only way it can sustain and not implode and not be blown back to space dust is to take energy from something else. It will. Unless it has enough D12, which it wouldn't be in that predicament if it did. If it had D12, it would realize, get it over with. Let me go back to space dust, because then I can get out of here. Then I can get free again. They can be free. It will be a long evolution for them, but they would go back into as the basic consciousness that forms the matrix they originally fell out of. And they would eventually be able to be renewed through new forms that would be created in that matrix. But they are living a reality where they're creator gods, and they have gods. There's a couple popular ones. One is called Jehovah. Another one is called Ahala. Gives you an idea of some of the gods here. There's another one called Brahma. There's several. And these are like D11. They call them D11 dark avatars. They're avatar collectives. D11, 11.5 at the highest level of them. That 0.5 they get from plugging into the Metatronic eye. Now, the lens of the eye of Metatron was only the beginning of what became a nightmare. It's a nightmare we've all been living. And sometimes there is a temporary reprieve in the reality of ignorance is bliss. We've been living that little space since 9558 BC. Kind of like let's take a breather and pretend we don't know anything. Since the 570 million years ago, since the Arimathea wormhole was created, a whole series of them were created to link through our gates into Phantom, to link the three together. There are also massive galactic wars, intergalactic wars, that were fought over this. There was a group of the original fallen ones in the Phantom Matrix that didn't want to go into the Weesadite Matrix. They didn't want to go into the Emerald Covenant either. So they were going to fight the Weesadeks. And they had members of their own that joined the Weesadeks. So it was splitting up of the races. There was a period of time called the Gaian-Orion Wars. And they took place 570 million years ago, right after the Arimathea wormhole was created, when there are massive wars fought in the Gaia system, which from here is Polaris, which is Earth's density 3 counterpart, and in the Orion system, where we have Stargate 8 in Mintaka Orion. There's also something called Alnitak and Alnilam Orion, and all of those systems with their various inhabited races in Phantom Matrix and in here and in Weesadek began to fight. The guys here didn't fight. They were trying to defend, because what was happening were the Weesadeks were coming through and they were seizing control of various of the Stargates in Phantom. They attached Metatronic lenses to Stargate 8 in Phantom Matrix, and that was Alnitak. They attached it to Stargate 10 in Vega. They connected one of their planets to the part of Vega that had entered Phantom Matrix. They worked themselves down from 11. They had at 11.5. They had their Aramat planet. They connected that to the moon in D11, the Avalon moon in Phantom. They connected next, that was D11, 11.5, and they connected the 10 systems, and they put out Metatronic, they called them seed atoms. They put Metatronic seed atoms, which were a series of lenses, into D10 Phantom Vega. Now the Phantom templates were created, a lot of them during the original fall, when Stargate 12 had been imploded through blocking Stargate 11. It had sent a portion into the Phantom imprint, which means reversal. It went into a reversed mathematical pattern, and they were all sustained by the Eye of Brahman that was put in. So, planetary system, dimensional system by dimensional system, the Weesadeks managed to create wormhole links through using this particular mathematics and crystal technology that were referred to as the Metatronic seed atoms, putting them in the stargates between Phantom and here. They linked through the halls of Amente before the halls of Mente were there. In fact, the halls of Mente were created later because of this. They were the natural stargates in our system. They began to seed them with the Metatronic atoms, which meant there is a bridge, that arc. They have their own Ark of the Covenant, and it's not a holy covenant either. They created arcs of frequency that would run from Silicate Matrix through our stargates into Phantom. And eventually, what their ultimate goal was to do it all the way down from D11 all the way down to D1, link all the systems together, and then use the power to pull both of them into their matrix. So you could pull this time matrix down, literally break it off from its D12 connection at 11.5 at the Metatronic eye, and reverse its whole mathematical coding, and reverse Phantom, and pull everything in them into the Metatronic imprint. That would be permanent if that were to happen. So of course the founders knew from the beginning that that was not going to be allowed to happen. There would be the sweep of the great cosmic cycle that would come through and open all of the highest gates and reset the D12 divine blueprint. What that would do would create a polarization wave that would separate anything that didn't belong in this divine blueprint originally and didn't have 30% of its original divine blueprint left because it had the Metatronic override, would be taken into the Metatronic system. It wasn't a choice the founders made to cause harm to the ones in the Metatronic system. The Metatronic races blame the founders for this. They take no responsibility for the fact that they're the ones that created this darn blasphemy of science themselves. They sealed their own destiny when they created the Metatronic distortion. And at this point, they are simply trying to feed on whatever's available. They've done an amazing thing. When I show you this one graph, it'll give you an idea of just the brilliance, the intelligence level. You can be really intelligent and really stupid at the same time. But the sophistication of intelligence or intellect that these beings have to be able to take science. They're not just moving bodies around, they're moving galaxies around. They're moving suns. They're connecting suns to suns to suns through stargates. When you think about the level of intelligence that it takes to do that, and the level of knowledge it takes to do that, and then you think about us here, right now, it's almost laughable on the cosmic game. But there's an innocence about us, our race. That's what's going to get us through. But this is where it can almost get scary if we didn't know better. Now, if we know our direct connection, we know we have our D12 frequency available now, and if we amplify that in our fields, we get those Merkabahs built, we're going to be okay. We don't have to be afraid. But boy, is this one of those underdog games. You know, you see those dramas with the underdog, the little guy, the David and Goliath. Well, right now, we're dealing with self-appointed creator gods from a fallen matrix that have painstakingly, over a very long period of the illusion of linear time, created a technology. We'll get more fully into the technology tomorrow. It's known as the beast. And in the Bible, it's referred to as the beast, with 7 heads and 10 horns, etc., etc. We don't have a free will choice as to how those things work. Once we come into the matrix and agree to do that, once we come into the time matrix and decide to be part of the space-time hologram, we've agreed to adopt those basic rules. So in that sense, we've given that part of our free will over to the privilege of having the experience in the time matrix. Now, within that framework of free will, within a greater framework of fixed, let's say, predestination, there are options available to us. They're called probable realities. That means there are, from any moment point, there are at least several, sometimes many, many, different courses of action that can evolve from that point. Because time is simultaneous and space occurs all in the same place, we will see one version of the possibilities of a choice or an event, but every other version will be experienced very often by a part of ourselves. The process of coming together of reclaiming your consciousness as an avatar is bringing together all of those probable selves, the pieces of yourself that followed this idea or that train of development. There are parts of ourselves now that are part of various different reality systems that are intimately connected to this one, probable versions of this space-time frame that have a probable version of history. The history that we have, that we're vibrationally connected to from our moment point, was created by a certain series of choices on a mass level, on a race level. It's called race karma, if you want to look at it that way. Race and planetary karma. There's also a galactic level of karma and a universal level of karma. Karma is really the accumulation of our choices. It determines what set of probabilities we as an individual will see. When we get home and are completely out of the matrix, we've experienced all of them because we pull all of our parts together. Now, within this field of probable action, probable choice, and probable realities, there is one version that contains all the others. It's called the heroic probability. In terms of a small self, you could look at it as the self that's going to be the one that accretes or pulls together all the others. It'll be the self that all the others will experience, let's say, their body death point or their body ascension point, and they will merge with the consciousness of the heroic probable self. There are probable selves for planets and for galaxies and for universes. So there are heroic selves for each of those levels. Right now, in our time continuum, we are encountering the heroic version of our planetary and galactic karmic or choice pattern. We are in the probability where something called the final conflict drama is beginning to unfold. Now, this has been a probability or a possibility that we would see ever since the Atlantean period that I speak about. That Atlantean period, you could say, ended in 9558 BC, but it began very long ago. It began here with the first seeding, which was 250 million years ago on this planet. There were two, actually that was parallel Earth, 250 million years ago. 25 million years ago, seeding one took place here, where the angelic human race was put here for the first time. It was destroyed by something called the electric wars 5.5 million years ago. Then there was a second seeding. They were destroyed by a very long-term war that was called the 1,000 Years' War. And then there was something called the Treaty of El Anu that was formed. It was an agreement between some of the fallen Anu Elohim races and the Emerald Covenant races, the Christos Founders races, that they would attempt for the third seeding, that they would stop warring with us and they would attempt for the third seeding to do bioregenesis for their races. The third seeding of our angelic human lineage began with the creation of the halls of Amente stargates. It began with the creation of the Ark of the Covenant, which was part of the Amente Stargate system. The Amente Stargate system began being built much earlier. It began being built in 560 million 50 million years ago, when the whole drama of warring with the Anu Elohim from Terra in density 2 came down to density 1. Progressively, more of the halls of Mente structure were put in from that period. And for the third seeding, because there had been so much damage done to the planet between the electric wars of the first seeding and the 1,000 Years' Wars of the second seeding, there was another, let's say, bypass. It's almost like a heart bypass, where you're bypassing the arteries that no longer work. They created the Ark of the Covenant, which was how our third seeding races were seeded onto this planet. When you come through stargates to get into a planet, it implies that your template takes upon the coding. It takes on the coding, the mathematical coding, and the stargates you come through. The Ark of the Covenant comes through from D12, which in our universal system is a place called Lyra Aramatana. That's our divine blueprint. And instead of going 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, like would be the normal case, where you get all of the coding, it goes from D12 to D9, which is Merak Andromeda, to D6, which is Sirius B. Then it crosses over through D5, which is Terra or Alcyone in the Pleiades. then over to D4, which is our solar gate, and down into D3, which is the earth gate. So we have the coding of the Ark of the Covenant contained within us. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't a big gold box that people were chasing around, but that was a little, let's say, sleight of hand that the Jehovian Anunnaki created in order to, let's say, divert attention after the Atlantean drama. So any recollection of things like Ark of the Covenant would have other meanings, so the races would never remember. Now, we're in a probability where, because of a set of choices that have been made through Atlantis from the period of, let's say, 50,000 BC up to 9,558 BC, that put us on a course of action that got us nearer and nearer to the heroic probability. But the heroic probability had the greatest potential of fulfillment, because it had the potential for fulfillment of the divine blueprint of this planetary system and this galactic system after literally 250 billion years of warring and having this system ripped apart. So it held the greatest potential victory, but it also had the greatest potential intensity as far as what the drama would look like. It wasn't known until literally the year 2000 whether or not this drama would be fulfilled during this period of time. We could have taken another probable version and waited about 2,000 years before we had to finish this. And by then maybe the Anunnaki races and the Anu Elohim races and the Draconian races might have been more, let's say, matured. Doubtful, but it's possible. It would have given them 2,000 more years to decide whether they wanted to play fair and whether they wanted to end up on the Christos side of the time matrix when the matrices were separated from each other. In the year 2000, some wonderful things happened that changed and locked us into our heroic probability. When we were able to anchor D12 frequency here for the first time since 208,216 BC, the fact that we had the D12 frequency available meant that the final conflict drama, the stargates would open, which meant the final conflict drama would unfold. Now this drama is so large that from our perspective here, it can seem overwhelming at first. That's why they've given it to us in pieces. For the last 2 years, we've been getting pieces of the history so we could understand one piece and then see where that piece fit into the next. There's a very long history here that has to do with Metatronics, and it has to do with a being called Metatron, and it has to do with the Anu Elohim. If we can understand the place that we exist within right now without letting it freak us out, just overwhelm us to where we want to go hide and believe in anything except this because it's too big and too scary and too much in the drama to deal with. If we can just face it and say, boy, that's interesting, didn't teach that in high school. We can stay in our power during this. Right now we're on a planet where most of the people are what we call sleepers. They're going to stay that way in this cycle. There's not enough time, and the drama has gone too far, too fast, for them to have time to sufficiently wake up and begin to understand these things. There are so many people that are absolutely addicted to dogmas because they've been told that's the way it is. Their generations before them have been told that's the way it is. They find their race identity through identifying themselves with any particular dogma. There are people in these regions that identify with the Olympian god dramas and all of that. There are the Christians that identify with the Christian dogmas. There are the Muslims that identify with the Muslim dramas, etc., etc., etc. If people could step beyond the dogmas and look for what the dogmas were originally intended to lead them toward, they would begin to look inside themselves. But their dogmas have taught them to be afraid of themselves. They've taught them that their God is outside and that they have to grovel in order to even get audience with that God. That's an illness. It's an illness like a virus that was given. That virus takes a while to cure, just like a computer virus. You can't just push a button and it's gone. Sometimes you really have to heal that program before the virus goes away. The races on the planet now are in no way prepared to hear the things that you're listening to now. But there are some, like you, that catch a little bit of information here or there and it resonates. Say, I want to find out more about that. You guys are the courageous ones. You want to know. You don't care what book you have to throw in the trash. You want to know what the truth is, because you have a feeling for connection to God. You have a feeling that came with you in this lifetime and in many others, and that feeling that guided you. You wouldn't have that feeling if you didn't have some degree of a Christos spark at birth. That means even if you started out as an Illuminati race person in one of the earlier dramas, you have managed to bring enough of the bioregenesis into the DNA where you have at least some of the 12 subharmonics and some of the strands, or you wouldn't relate to this material at all. It would completely turn you off, and you probably hate the messenger, like a lot of people out there do. Now, when we get into Metatronics, Metatron, who is Metatron? Where'd that word come from? Metatron is the name of a family collective. It's a family collective out of an entity. Now, an entity is something above a rishi, the first level of ascended masters, consciousness collective. There's an entity called Giovanni. Giovanni was an entity in good standing, as most entities are. Giovanni was part of the collective that created the Christos founders races that seeded this time matrix 950 billion years ago. It was the groups of Elohim that were commissioned to Stargate 11, which was Avion in Lyra. They were commissioned as the guardians, the Christos founders guardians of Stargate 11, that became convoluted, code convoluted, which began their downfall, both genetically, template-wise, and of consciousness. That particular group were out of the entity called Giovanni. Because of the fall that took place, the genetic fall and the creation of the black hole that I'll talk about in a minute, it was created 250 billion years ago, the entity Giovanni fell. Because there's a law of physics that applies. If you are an ascended master being, you have your pieces up there, your parts of self stationed out of the time matrix. You send in X amount of energy of yourself into the matrix. If you sent in, and most don't, but on occasion, as an ascended master collective will send in more than a natural proportion of its energy into the matrix, say for a salvage mission. If the salvage team you sent in goes down too, it takes the whole collective down. So there was an entity that fell as a result of what took place 250 billion years ago. 250 billion years ago in Lyra, there was something called the, oh boy, what did that do?
Somebody doesn't like.
They're called the Lyran Elohim
I
Wars.
just brought you to show you that we're having some technical difficulties.
I think Metatron's a little upset, probably.
However, we have team members at reception, so they're trying to slow it down.
Are they coming out all right? What did it do?
Well, it's because they have two machines.
Yeah.
One that they use for this, which has.
Hello, Metatron. 250 billion years ago, an event took place in the Lyra star system, the cradle of Lyra, with the Christos founders races, the races from Stargate 11, the guardians of Avion Gate 11, and the guardians of Gate 10, which is Vega Lyra, began to war with each other because both of them suffered code convolution. The Omicron Draconian races, who were of the Seraphi Seraphim, were the Gate 10 guardians, and a particular group out of the Giovanni entity of Elohim were the guardians of Gate 11. Both of them were getting a bit out of hand as far as taking a free will concept and literally turning it in on itself and becoming authoritarian. Because free will and authoritarian dictatorship do not go hand in hand. They are in direct opposition. Both of them began to play that game with each other. And after a while of the D11 Elohim pushing the Draconians around, the Draconians managed to evolve in a certain way that they were a bit stronger. So they began to take back territory. They began to push back. And at this point, the Elohim commissioned High Council, which were the ones who were guardians, the Elohim, the Elohai Elohim, who were guardians of Gate 12, and they said, these guys are out of control. We want you to destroy them. And we said, excuse me, we don't destroy anybody. By the way, did you notice that you've been out of control for a while too? Why don't we all sit down and figure out how we can help both of you heal? They didn't like that answer. They threatened High Council that if you don't destroy them, we'll destroy them. And not only that, we will destroy your gate and you as well, and we will take over the matrix. That was a very sick decision to make. It was a choice that was made because they had an idea. These were Creator God people. These were Elohim that knew just almost as much as the other Elohim. They knew that if Source could create using the template that we talked about yesterday in the Dance Floor programs, where you have 15 spheres, well, what if you took just 7? They knew there was a way to bend the mathematics, which would bend the light and the sound and the scalar waves into a form that could actually repel itself and cut itself off from the natural matrix. It would still exist within the entire matrix, but it would be their own system. They decided they wanted to turn this time matrix into that, which was a direct violation of something called the Emerald Covenant. The Emerald Covenant was the original agreement that the Giannis Ascended Masters agreed upon when they decided to create this time matrix together. It was a free will system, and it was built upon the law of one, which is acknowledgement that we are all of the same source, and that loving co-creation is the only sane and natural way of being in an understanding of yourself as part of the one. That was the original tenets and precepts by which this matrix was created. The Elohim of Gate 11 decided that they were going to do it different. They were going to break that covenant, and they were going to destroy the races who wouldn't cooperate with them, and they were going to take it over and run it their way. The only thing standing in their way of doing that were the Elohai Elohim of Gate 12. They could dominate the things lower in coding than them. They could, when push came to shove, use their ability to run higher frequency because they had the D11 coding. The Seraphai Seraphim had D10 coding. So they could, if they wanted to, use that superiority and ability to run frequency to get rid of the draconian races. But they would have a hard time doing it to get rid of the Elohai Elohim races because they had D12 and higher capacity. But there is a way to turn the natural physics of creation in on itself. If you can think of the Cathara grid and the Stargate systems as a conduit of energy, and when energy is coming into the matrix, it spirals down through the primal light and sound fields into D12 and then D11, 10, 9, 8. Now, if you block energy at Gate 11, the energy is still coming in through 12, but it bounces back. And it creates a backflow that amplifies. So you can, and it was theoretic at that point, theoretically, you could sever the connection at Gate 12 and have Gate 11 and down be your own little universe if you wanted to hijack it. That was their idea. It worked. And there was a choice that the Elohai made. There was a choice to defend or to allow. Now the Elohai knew that they were eternal. Death isn't something that frightened them. They were completely beyond that. They knew that if they were to defend themselves, because they had superior power capacity, that those who attempted to destroy them would literally have the energy bounce back at themselves and literally wipe them out and the systems they were connected to. It would not only take out the Elohim that were posing the challenge, it would take out the Seraphai Seraphim, both the fallen ones, and a group called the Odedikron. The Odedikron were a race of Seraphai Seraphim who had co-governance over Stargate 10, Vega, with the Omicron Draconians. The Odedikrons were the reptilians. There is a difference between the Draconians and the reptilians. The Draconians were the dragon moth people. They were the dinoids. They created dinosaur-like, as opposed to snake-like, as opposed to smaller reptilian. The Omicron dragon moth dinoids were fully involved in the competition for the time matrix. They knew what the Elohim were going to do, and they decided they would do it too. They didn't petition for help. they said, fine, we'll both get rid of them, and then we'll go after each other and see who gets the matrix. But the Odedicron, the reptilians, didn't want to play the game. They were stuck in the Gate 10 system, and they petitioned for help. But because you had Gate 11 and the Elohim in the middle, in between Gate 12 and Gate 10, we weren't able to rescue or get the Odedicron out. So if the decision to defend by simply putting up a shield around Gate 12 was chosen, it would have taken out both Gate 11 and Gate 10, which could have been repaired. It would have taken a long time, but it could have been repaired using Gate 12. But those consciousness that were in those systems would be fragmented back to space dust. They'd still be part of God, as I've said. You can never be not part of God. But races that had beautiful potential, and they'd already come a long way in their evolution. They'd evolved from 950 billion years ago to 250 billion years ago. That's a lot of evolution. And they had reached wondrous things in their own right in certain ways. It was primarily because of the Odedicron, of the reptilians, that the founders chose to allow, knowing they were taking a burden onto themselves. But it was the only way that if they allowed it, they would slowly be able to heal it. They knew a black hole would be created if this were allowed. They tried to talk them out of it, but they didn't want to listen. The Elohim did not want to listen. Instead of defending themselves, they allowed the Elohim to back up Gate 11 and reverse it. And that created a backflow, and it literally shattered the divine blueprint and blew up the stargates in Lyra Aramatena. That would have to be reassembled later using the D13 and higher primal light fields to reset the pattern. It created a black hole system. That black hole system came to be known as Phantom Matrix. Phantom Matrix was originally a part of this time matrix. Phantom Matrix started with simply part of the D11 Avion gate and what was that planetary system or star system, and the D10 Vega Lyra system. But it grew much bigger than was ever intended. When the Phantom Matrix was created by the Anu Elohim, they came to call themselves the Anu Elohim. The Giovanni entity hadn't fully fallen. A portion of that entity had fallen. And because of that, it sent another portion of itself into the matrix to try to rescue the part of itself that had fallen. That was a risky thing to do because, again, it comes down to how much energy is on which side. Normally, an entity would put X amount of itself into the matrix at one time. Well, it already lost a big chunk of itself, so it put more of itself in. And there was a chance that was taken. If that part ended up getting distorted also and wasn't strong enough to pull the others back out, it would make more critical mass of reversed mess in the matrix than what the collective had itself, the Ascendant Master Collective had itself. And that is what happened, but it happened in stages. When the original fall happened, the original sin, when Stargate 11 blew up 250 billion years ago, and Phantom Matrix was created, there were precautionary things put in motion, knowing that it was going to occur. There was something called the Eye of Brahman that was created at D12.5. Now that was a little bit beyond the D12 Stargate. The Eye of Brahman was a polarization refraction lens that would allow the primal light fields from the natural to this time matrix to refract through and literally anchor into the Phantom Matrix, to hold it, to give it a structure so it could begin to restructure itself instead of going completely back to space dust. Because what happens when a black hole is created? A template is shattered like a crystal that's crushed with a hammer. It gets twisted, the energy gets twisted and reversed, but if it has any portion of its template that has enough frequency, it can begin to accrete again. What usually happens in a black hole system is it accretes like to like frequency, but it's missing pieces, and it isn't able to accrete functionally. So it accretes on a distorted template compared to its original mathematics. The Eye of Brahman was intended to allow the pattern of the natural template of this time matrix to be put back in to phantom matrix. So when it began to reaccrete itself and the consciousness began to pull itself together, it would still have, eventually, after it accreted enough, it would have access to getting plugged back in to its original divine blueprint. That was the original intention. So there was a lens, the first eye, the Eye of Brahman, created. And it was created by the Christos founders and the Yanas, ascended masters races, in order to give the beings that would be caught in the black hole system an opportunity to re-evolve instead of being, blown back to space dust. And again, it was done primarily because you had several innocent races, but primarily the Odedicron, who had been persecuted by the draconian races progressively more and more. There was no way they could get out of the system, and they had always been in good standing with the Christos founders races. So there was a commitment made on behalf of them, but also on behalf of the others, because even though the Anu Elohim had gone off on their own tangent and become very dangerous creator gods, they had become anti-creator gods, anti-Christic creator gods, they were still loved, and there was still if there's life, there's hope, hopefully. So it was a decision of love, but it was a decision of accepting, out of love, accepting a huge, massive responsibility. The responsibility of knowing how dangerous this healing experiment could be. Because if it went wrong, if it went bad, it could not only take down this whole matrix, but if it did, that would allow it to have enough frequency where it could begin to poke holes into other time matrices as well. It wasn't a decision that was made by a couple of people. It was a decision that was made through the Ascended Masters Yanis councils of various different time matrices that could be directly affected if it went wrong and if it went bad. There was a whole lot of them that didn't want it tried. But there was enough, and it came down to a vote. And it came down to some of the older time matrices that were much older than 950 billion years old, had been through something similar to this long time before, and it didn't work. I said, okay, you guys have a good idea, sweet children. You really, really, really want to try it. Now, you've looked at what could happen. The outcome, if it's successful, we will look up to you because we tried a similar thing when a similar thing happened in our matrices. But it didn't work, and it created absolute havoc. We would have liked for it to work. So, because we would like to know where we went wrong, maybe you can do it better. And if you're willing to take responsibility, that means you don't get out of there. If it goes bad, you stay in there until you fix it, right? So it doesn't hurt anything else. So the creator gods, the Anu Elohim and the Seraphi Seraphim and the Brahmarama races that were the original three Christos founders races of this matrix, and their Yanis Ascendant Masters collective said, yeah, we want to try. So the permission was given for us to try, and that's why the Eye of Brahman was allowed to be set up. So the phantom matrix wouldn't just go back into implosion within itself, because when a system goes into black hole and it begins to accrete, it will accrete to a certain point where it begins to literally pull energy from itself, because it pulls all its pieces together and it has nothing left to do but continue to pull, and it pulls itself into compaction, and it goes into what's called molecular compaction or atomic compaction, and it implodes on itself. It has to do with magnetic and electrical fields. So by setting up the Eye of Brahman, there was an opportunity being made where the black hole would accrete, but at a certain point in its accretion, it would reach enough frequency in reverse that it could possibly be plugged in to the D13 primal light fields so it could be brought back around. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try, at least so we thought at the time. Well, when this occurred, one of the big heroes in the drama was going to be Giovanni. Giovanni wanted to make sure, because Giovanni felt responsible because it was Giovanni's family that had created the fallen Anu Elohim. There's a particular collective of the Giovanni family, like a smaller family within a family, that was called Metatron. Metatron, at a certain point, became directly involved. Now, the Eye of Brahma was set up 250 billion years ago in preparation for, it was actually set up before they did the final blowing up of Stargate 12. That's when the decision to allow was given. Once the Stargate blew up, the Eye of Brahman activated, and it began to hold the Phantom Matrix from totally going into reversal, where it dropped so low in frequency that you couldn't plug into it anymore. And there was a degree of successful evolution between 250 billion years ago and 150 billion years ago. We got a lot of the Odedicron races out, and even some of the fallen Anu Elohim and fallen Draconian races were able to do bioregenesis and get back out into the natural matrix. There was a problem that was manifesting itself in relation to some of the Anu Elohim that were being rehabilitated, the ones that had been out of the Metatron Giovanni collective. You could get them out to about D11, and then they were what's called host matrix, because they didn't have the D12 frequency anymore. They were hosted into another collective of the Brahmarama races. So you ended up with a hybrid, because the Brahmarama races had the lowest frequency of the Christos founders races. So the Anu Elohim had the second highest before they couldn't plug into their own matrix, so they were hosted through the Brahmarama races. But they still held a mentality, even after they would undergo hosting, of dictatorial type governance. Their distortions had gone so deep, and because they still didn't have a full D12 pattern back, at D12 you start to get something. You start to get it consciously. You start to feel it. We are all one. That means I am you and you are me. That means I treat you the way I would want to be treated. That means we cooperate and not fight. Without the full D12 pattern, that cognition cannot fully come in. So they still didn't have that cognition. They began to pose a danger to, even when they'd be hosted out, they were posing a danger to the Brahmarama races. So there was another decision made, and this is where Metatron came in full force. There was another lens put in, another polarization refraction lens. The original one stayed, the Brahmarama, or the Brahman, the Eye of Brahman stayed. That was to hold Phantom Matrix intact. This other lens, that was called the Eye of Yahweh, or Yod-He-Vod-He, was put in. It was the Metatronic eye. It was put in to allow a, what would you call it, shortcut. So the races, the fallen Anu Elohim races, because they were still posing a danger, where they could do a shortcut. They didn't have to make it all the way up to D12. They could do a shortcut into another matrix that was actually more authoritarian. It was not a matrix that was originally created on a free will system. It was a healing matrix, almost like how you look at our, perhaps our prisons for violent criminal type people. And it was agreed, the Metatron and the Giovanni entity agreed that their races needed rehabilitation, more strict rehabilitation. They were still not capable of functioning fairly in a free will system. They would abuse if they were given power. And because of that, the Metatron collective created, and were permitted to create, the Eye of Metatron, or the Eye of Yahweh. They're one and the same. This lens was supposed to, it was positioned at D11.5, which is between gate 11 and gate 12. All right, so it wasn't as high up in frequency as the Eye of Brahman. And it was they would be able to evolve and get that mathematical coding, and then it would take them over into another matrix system. And it was actually another black hole system that had made some progress. It was the original one from way back that the other time matrices, the other Janus Ascendant Masters had said, well, we tried and it didn't work. Right. They were still trying to heal and rehab that one, and there were certain portions of it that were rehabbing. they were partially successful. So it was decided by the Metatron entity and its Giovanni collective and the Ascended Masters collectives that the ones that were causing problems, they could, for the Brahmarama races, would be hosted out into this matrix where they could finish their evolution there. All right. This was originally supposed to be an evolutionary shortcut, because in certain terms, if they were successful there, it would take them less time to evolve back into full ascended mastery than if they stayed here to fully regenerate the Christos template. There were certain perks for them to go. It was originally called the Path of Arimathea. It had to do with a planet or a star called Arimathus that was part of this matrix. Now, Arimathus, at the time that these decisions were made to allow the Eye of Metatron to be put in, Arimathus was kind of like a crown jewel in that particular fallen matrix, because it was beginning to get its D11.5 frequencies back, where it was this close to being able to go back into being reversed to a D12 natural pattern. So there was this chance taken by putting in the Metatronic Eye, or the Eye of Yahweh, that would create a link between that system. It was supposed to be a one-way link. You could go this way, but they could not come this way. All right, that was to protect this matrix. And it didn't link into this matrix, it linked into Phantom, and Phantom linked into here. Well, large numbers of the fallen Anu Elohim did evolve out via the Eye of Metatron, or the Eye of Yahweh. And then a problem happened over in Aramat. We call it Aramat for short. And Arimathus, the new influx of the still semi-distorted consciousness from this matrix got together with the distorted consciousness from other systems in that matrix and invited them up to Arimathus. And together they took over Arimathus. And this created a situation for the Giovanni Metatron family. They were losing some of the guardian ones that they had sent in to assist had actually gone into the Phantom Matrix and escorted the others out into the other matrix. And when there were rebellions over in their system, it was called the Wisadek system, when there was rebellion in the Wisadek system, the guardian races sent by Metatron and sent by Giovanni were also overtaken, and their consciousness was entrapped. There are certain ways you can entrap a being in a body, and we'll get into this in a little bit. It has to do with creating an electrostatic body as opposed to an electrodynamic body. An electrodynamic body allows frequency to move freely through. An electrostatic body keeps it circulating, where it just circulates within itself and it blocks the currents. There were particular genetic experiments done, and also planetary grid experiments and galactic grid experiments done in the Wisadek matrix that created a situation where about 89% of the energy of Giovanni Metatron was literally put into reversal. And when that happens, it creates like a black hole pulling on the Ascendant Master Collective itself. And there was a choice made by that matrix to either sever its connection completely to those of itself that it had lost. What this meant was it was going to fall. One way or another, it was going to fall. Because if you can't hold enough frequency to stay in resonance with the primal light and sound fields, with the primal sound fields, especially where the Ascendant Master levels are, that means you're coming into the matrix whether you want to or not. All right, if you lose a certain percentage as an Ascended Master, if you lose a certain percentage of your consciousness, because it's embodied in things that fall, they will pull you in. And the Metatron Giovanni collective realized it was going to go in. It could have maintained itself at a D12 level and began its evolution from there. It would have had a big chore on its hands. It would have had to sever, first of all, its connection to its parts that were in the Wisadek matrix, and then it would have had to progressively accrete frequency until it could host out. It would have to host out, and it would become kind of like a baby Ascended Master Collective again, instead of a very old-time collective. The collective made a decision, and it was the collective, the Metatron collective of the Giovanni collective. They made a decision that they would do their fall in a certain way. they started to have, you can almost look at it as a virus. The parts of themselves that had fallen were still in communication electronically with the collective. Now the ones that were in the matrix didn't know it, but every little thought that the fallen ones felt, its Ascended Master Collective felt, and it began to take on the same attitudes. And one of the biggest and worst attitudes, and it's still a virus in this time matrix, is the attitude of blame. The Metatron entity, the Giovanni Metatron entity, decided to blame the other Ascended Master Collectives for its fall. It was reminded that it agreed to do this. It was the one that was gung-ho, going to save the matrix, going to pull all itself out and all that. But it had enough of the influence of its fallen ones, that were 89% of its consciousness at this point, saying, it's somebody else's fault. It's your fault, so we're going to pay. That collective made a decision that it would use its knowledge of primal creation physics, and that it would take over the matrix, this matrix. That was originally what its fallen parts had wanted, and what it had tried to stop its fallen parts from doing. And there was a little problem when this decision was made, because there was the Eye of Yahweh, the Metatron Eye, that was completely under the governance of the Metatronic entity of Giovanni. The Giovanni entity, through the collective of Metatron, turned control of that polarization refraction lens over to the Wisadek collectives. And they were able to use that to display it. It was already tapped into the phantom matrix on this time matrix. They were able to create, by feeding energy off this time matrix and off phantom. They would pull energy from our time matrix, from the phantom matrix. They would use phantom matrix to pull it from here into their matrix. As long as they were able to feed off something else that had its life force connection to source, they wouldn't go into implosion. If the matrices were severed, they would go into implosion eventually. They get a few billion years of evolution out of it. But eventually they would be a deteriorating system. They would become extinct in terms of the race identity that they held. They would go back to source as units of consciousness. And that was unacceptable to them. Now, when the Metatron Collective made the decision to turn the Eye of Yahweh over to the Wisadek Matrix, it had to be reprogrammed. The original program, mathematical scalar program of the Eye of Metatron, was compatible with this time matrix and with the phantom matrix and with source. It had the potentiality of regenerating into Christos. In order to do what they did by allowing creating the Eye of Metatron in a way, putting a program in that would allow it to actually reverse certain things so it could feed, instead of just being a conduit that could take some energy, which was supposed to be the collectives getting hosted over, it would be able to open it both ways, send energy in and pull energy out. In other words, send energy in as a carrier wave to drag more energy out than it was supposed to. In order to do this, the programming on the Eye of Metatron had to be changed. It had to be changed from its original base 12, base 15 compatible, and I mean base 12, base 15, the D12 Christos pattern, but built on those 15 spheres that we talked about yesterday in the basic structure, where you have a set of 7 and then another set of 7, and then that takes place within one. All right, so you have 15 spheres. The mathematics were altered in the Eye of Metatron lens to a base 7, where it was like taking the yolk out of an egg. So they would build their system, they would restructure their black hole system on the 7 pattern, which was literally cutting it off from the primal light and sound fields, but allowing it to plug into other systems on their lower heavens level that were built on the 7, because you have the 7 higher and lower heavens. So they took the lower heavens pattern, used it to reprogram and organize their black hole, and that allowed them to be able to tap into other lower heaven systems, other Veka systems. This created a distortion in the consciousness that was part of the Silicate Matrix. The Silicate Matrix people were doing bad enough as it was before they had Metatron get involved. They had certain successes as far as Aramatsus was concerned. Aramatsus was a planet that was, or a planetary system that was evolving close to where it could be brought back to its Christos imprint. But once the Eye of Metatron was used and run through the Aramatsus stargates, it completely changed that. It completely redid the mathematical structure of their stargates so they couldn't plug in to a system, to a Christos system. So it not only posed a threat to our time matrix, but it totally, all the progress that had been made in healing the Silicate system had been totally unplugged and undone. And the thing with the Metatronic system is it's permanent. Some things in physics can be undone. Some things reach critical mass, and if they reach a critical mass of distortion where there's less than 30% of their natural Christos template left, they become something else, and they're no longer compatible with their own template. That's what happened with the Silicate Matrix. The consciousness that was residing in that matrix, and the planetary systems and the stargates in that matrix, can't be plugged in again because of the choices that were made. And the main choice was made by the Metatron Giovanni entity, but it was made on behalf of many other collectives of the fallen ones that had petitioned to do, petitioned for them to do this. Please, you have control of the lens. Give us life, give us eternal life. You know that we'll implode. All they had to do was agree to bioregenesis and agree to play fair. If they had entered the Emerald Covenant, they would have been able to evolve out. But it was known, and their scientists, their high-mind scientists knew that if they created this artificial mathematical structure, there was a way of bending light and sound that was based on the Vesica Pisces, two interwoven spheres. Now, the natural time matrix is based on a trivecca, not a bivecca. First there's the trivecca, and the bivecca is part of that. You would go single, bivecca, trivecca. That's a natural structure. What they did was simply use the Eye of Metatron as their 0 point or their 1 point and build a double from there, a bivecca from there. They created artificial light through this particular synthesis of mathematics. They created totally polarized light through this process, because at least with the trivecca you have the two polarized points that are unified through the third. In their universe, everything is bipolar. It's like having a real bad chemical day, bipolar disorder. It's a whole universal system that's structured on bipolar disorder, which implies they have extremes of dramas. They have extreme highs and extreme lows, and they're constantly in that cycle. Now, the races that were in the Silicate Matrix at that time, they chose this. They wanted this, most of them, at least the creator gods, what they call themselves creator gods in that matrix, wanted it, because it would promise them one thing. As long as that Eye of Metatron was their vampire energy-sucking device, they would have eternal life. They would be immortal. They would have the closest thing they could get to ascension without having to cooperate. They could have got regular ascension if they just, decided to be nice and didn't want to play Masters of the Universe. The Metatronic bodies that were created through the programming are very interesting structures. They take part of what would be a normal living biological structure, and they take out certain parts, the mathematics that are missing, or pieces of the template that are missing, and they plug in certain parts of the template together that weren't originally meant to be plugged in together. Completely destroys the entire template when it's fully done. There's not 30% left where you can do bioregenesis to plug it back into its natural divine blueprint. It creates an atrocity. It creates something other than what was originally created in the Christos vein, and it creates something that is not compatible with the mathematics or the scalar frequencies of the Christos divine blueprint for this matrix or any other one. So in making a choice to be immortal, they made a choice to be finite, because their immortality is dependent on sucking energy from living things, living matrices. That's why they will go out of their way, and that's why at this point We'll get into the drama more tomorrow because I want to get into the history. So I want by tomorrow when we start to talk about what this means to us and why we need to know it today, I want you to understand, the history of where this comes from. But there were races of consciousness created, both of draconian, because some of the draconian races that were in Phantom decided they wanted to play. That sounds good. Yeah, we can be immortal. Yeah, we can be immortal without having to cooperate with them. Yeah, now we can fight with you. Right? There were a whole bunch of hybrid races created from the races of the fallen matrix. These began about 150 billion years ago. They started this connection with the Silicate Matrix. By 570 million years ago, it had become an absolute outrage. Because 570 million years ago, the races and collectives that had agreed to go into the Metatronic pattern, and Metatron wasn't being prejudiced at that point, the more we can get the better, so they would let any of them, if the Odetticron wanted to come out of Phantom, they'd take them over there. If the Omicron wanted, they'd take them over there. What they didn't tell them is when they got on the other side, they'd become assimilated, which means their consciousness would be repatterned. They call it dot adjusting. There are some programs out there right now that teach you how to meet your thought adjuster. We'll talk about those tomorrow. But they would literally assimilate the consciousness of the being that came over into the electrostatic bodies that they had created themselves through the Metatronic imprint. They ate them, energetically speaking. It wasn't eating with big teeth and ripping flesh. It was transmuting the flesh through a certain type of Merkaba. And once the consciousness was in Merkaba, bringing it over and assimilating it through the reverse Merkaba fields that they had created through the Metatronic reversals. The Metatronic program that allowed for this artificially sustained dead living system were reversals of portions, where you took portions of the natural divine blueprint and pulled pieces out, pulled frequencies out. What was a base 12 was reduced to a base 8, which meant there are 8 sub-frequency bands in every dimension instead of 12, and there were only 11 dimensions instead of 12. This structure, through this structure, this program, and then they take that structure and then they reverse the mathematical programming on it. That was the last step I wanted to explain there. So they take pieces out, make it a base 8, and reverse it. And then it would repel itself from the natural matrices, but it had the Metatronic eye where it could siphon energy off other systems. The body forms created through this structure are pretty awesome. They're like astral bodies, like what we might consider our astral body or our ghost body. They would have the image of the being that originally went into the Silicate Matrix and adopted the Metatronic program. So let's say if you decided you wanted to go, you would be able to maintain yourself, but you'd be kind of like ghost-like. It would be an electrostatic body, a body that didn't evolve or grow or change. It always stayed that way, as long as you fed it. And what you would feed it by would be the frequencies of other living things. Now, 570 million years ago, after many races were created within the Silicate Matrix on the Metatronic program, they decided it was time to come and get what they wanted, which was the rest of us, which was the Phantom Matrix first. So it was an interesting thing. The Phantom Matrix axis, if you look at our universal stargates as one Cathara grid, the Phantom Matrix axis came in at a 22.5 degree angle, but was running reverse, but it was a 22.5 degree shift from our vertical axis. The Silicate Matrix was on the other side, 22.5 degree shift. We were right in the middle. So they found a way to barrel through, to use wormhole technology, which is poking holes in the natural template to connect things that aren't supposed to be connected. That's like connecting the artery that runs through your neck to the one that runs through your heart to create a bypass that doesn't belong there. And eventually it collapses because it doesn't work really well, because it's not natural. They created something called the Arimathea wormhole. They used Aramatzus, which was their D11.5 star system planet that had almost made it into, return to Christic template, but fell. They created a wormhole between that through the moon of our, not our moon, but the moon of our D11 gate. Now our D11 gate was Avion. Its moon was called Avalon. They created the wormhole through Avalon and into Phantom, so it made an arc of open frequency. That began the building of something called the cube matrix. The cube matrix is the wonderful creation, the quite brilliant creation of divine science used with an anti-Christos intention. It is a, let's say, created life field. You could compare it to artificial intelligence, really. It's created without a soul because it's disconnected from what you would consider soul. It's disconnected from its connection to source, but it is able to sustain by science. The Metatronic lens is science. This is high science used for perversion. It wasn't originally. Metatron originally was a good guy. But that changed, and when that changed, a whole new type of creation was brought into being that was never seen. It was literally a beginning point, which is hard to do when time is simultaneous. Wait a minute, what begins first? So obviously somewhere, the potentiality for it existed all along in the creations that Source created when it created the matrix itself. But I think, this is my speculation, maybe when we get all up there and we have the whole thing back, then we may feel differently. I think even Source was a bit surprised at how well that it actually was possible that this could take place. That also implies that if Source knew that that potentiality existed and would therefore probably be explored, it also knew there must be ultimately a healing. And Source did know there would be a healing, because a worst case scenario, even if everything imploded, it was still within itself, within Source. So Source itself was willing to gamble just to see what to experience, what it could create. Source learns. It's not a static field. From every experience it creates for itself, it learns something new. Except it's already something it already knew. It's very hard to describe direct cognition of simultaneous time and simultaneous space. It's hard to... Might suck some things in until it hits a certain critical mass. But at some point, when this resetting occurs, but there will always be a cosmic cycle of resetting of the divine blueprint, and that ensures that anything that became disharmonic, any black hole systems that were made, will be severed from the original matrix. That gets healed, and the other one has X amount of energy left, however much it managed to siphon, and it will have evolution until it expends its energy, and then it will implode upon itself, and it will become part of the particles, the particae, particae, and particum that make up the dimensional fields. And what will happen then, once it's purged, is like a purification where it clears its own distortions by blowing itself apart. Those units of consciousness returned to innocence will then reassimilate into the original matrix from which they fell. But there will be no memory of the fall or of what they were. We're at a position right now where a cosmic cycle is coming to ending and a beginning. The Metatronic bodies are frightening things in a way, because the races that agreed to participate in order to have short-term immortality in exchange for eternal life, they sentenced themselves to that destiny, the path of Arimathea that was originally intended as a path of evolution, a faster path of evolution back into Christendom, became the path of de-evolution. It became the path of the Metatronic imprint, which has no alternative but to return to Source through implosion. Now, there are vast races there at this point, because the evolution has gone for so long. There are many, many races that originally started out as a handful of races of Draconian, Weesadek. Now, Weesadeks were the ones who originally weren't even part of this matrix. They had fallen from another collective and created that black hole system, that ours got hooked into. And the Anu Elohim. All of these races, there was just a small amount of them from the higher density fields, the higher dimensional fields, like D11, D10. Once they had made the Metatronic promise, and they had allowed their templates to be recoded, they created spawn. They created more of themselves. They, just like the creator gods, just like Source created the Ascended Masters, and the Ascended Masters created the Rishi, and the Rishi created the Avatars and the Christos Founders races, and they created us down here. They decided, well, now we've got our own universe. We're masters of the universe now. Now we're God over here. And they began to create and populate their matrix with more and more races that had to feed off other living races in order to sustain their matrix. So at this point, there are many, many races there. And there's a reason in here why there's a lot of people that you can look at things that are Christic and anti-Christic, and you can understand them as part of a larger understanding that Source has, or you can go into blame, and you can call one bad, evil, and it should be destroyed. Or you can understand what it's about and where it fits, and you can perhaps feel for the destiny it chose for itself. So even though you can't allow it to harm you, you can still find love. How horrific the things are that it might have done. The races of Phantom Matrix, once they became combined with the Weesadek Matrix, became a force of what, on this planet and many others, is known as the Antichrist. It is a collective, it's not just a singular. But imagine if you were a being. Now imagine if you were a being that you didn't have a lot of memory of where you came from, because they don't give their own memory of where they came from. That your only destiny was implosion, unless you tapped into other systems. What if you knew that ascension was no longer even a possibility for you? That the only way you could go home and be healed to go back to where you came from was to do it in total innocence, like a child, with no knowing whatsoever, because you'd go back in pieces. There's a terror in that feeling, the terror of annihilation. That great, my parts might go back, but I'm not going to know it. There's a feeling of being finite. And if you look around at the world we're in today, you can see the huge effect that these races have had once they begin to blend with the races here. Because most of our dogmas that we talked about earlier, the religious dogmas, even the science dogmas, are all coming from that place. They're all coming from a place where ascension really isn't an option. Survival of the fittest is one of the things that happens when a race realizes it's finite. And the only way it can sustain and not implode and not be blown back to space dust is to take energy from something else. It will. Unless it has enough D12, which it wouldn't be in that predicament if it did. If it had D12, it would realize, get it over with. Let me go back to space dust, because then I can get out of here. Then I can get free again. They can be free. It will be a long evolution for them, but they would go back into as the basic consciousness that forms the matrix they originally fell out of. And they would eventually be able to be renewed through new forms that would be created in that matrix. But the races that agreed to participate in order to have short-term immortality in exchange for eternal life they sentenced themselves to that destiny, the path of Arimathea that was originally intended as a path of evolution, a faster path of evolution back into Christendom, became the path of de-evolution. It became the path of the Metatronic imprint, which has no alternative but to return to source through implosion. Now, there are vast races there at this point, because the evolution has gone for so long. There are many, many races that originally started out as a handful of races of Draconian, Weesadek. Now, Weesadeks were the ones who originally weren't even part of this matrix. They had fallen from another collective and created that black hole system, that ours got hooked into. And the Anu Elohim. All of these races, there was just a small amount of them from the higher density fields, the higher dimensional fields, like D11, D10. Once they had made the Metatronic promise, and they had allowed their templates to be recoded, they created spawn. They created more of themselves. They, just like the creator gods, just like Source, created the Ascended Masters, and the Ascended Masters created the Rishi, and the Rishi created the Avatars and the Christos Founders races, and they created us down here. They decided, well, now we've got our own universe. We're masters of the universe now. Now we're God over here. And they began to create and populate their matrix with more and more races that had to feed off other living races in order to sustain their matrix. So at this point, there are many, many races there. And there's a reason in here why there's a lot of people that you can look at things that are Christic and anti-Christic, and you can understand them as part of a larger understanding that Source has, or you can go into blame, and you can call one bad, evil, and it should be destroyed. Or you can understand what it's about and where it fits, and you can perhaps feel for the destiny it chose for itself. So even though you can't allow it to harm you, you can still find love, no matter how horrific the things are that it might have done. The races of Phantom Matrix, once they became combined with the Weesadek Matrix, became a force of what, on this planet and many others, is known as the Antichrist. It is a collective, it's not just a singular. But imagine if you were a being. Now, imagine if you were a being that you didn't have a lot of memory of where you came from, because they don't give their own memory of where they came from. You were living in planetary systems. What if you found out that your only destiny was implosion, unless you tapped into other systems? What if you knew that ascension was no longer even a possibility for you? That the only way you could go home and be healed to go back to where you came from was to do it in total innocence, like a child, with no knowing whatsoever, because you'd go back in pieces. There's a terror in that feeling, the terror of annihilation. That great, my parts might go back, but I'm not going to know it. There's a feeling of being finite. And if you look around at the world we're in today, you can see the huge effect that these races have had once they begin to blend with the races here. Because most of our dogmas that we talked about earlier, the religious dogmas, even the science dogmas, are all coming from that place. They're all coming from a place where ascension really isn't an option. Survival of the fittest is one of the things that happens when a race realizes it's finite. And the only way it can sustain and not implode and not be blown back to space dust is to take energy from something else. It will. Unless it has enough D12, which it wouldn't be in that predicament if it did. If it had D12, it would realize, get it over with. Let me go back to space dust, because then I can get out of here. Then I can get free again. They can be free. It will be a long evolution for them, but they would go back into as the basic consciousness that forms the matrix they originally fell out of. And they would eventually be able to be renewed through new forms that would be created in that matrix. But they are living a reality where they're creator gods, and they have gods. There's a couple popular ones. One is called Jehovah. Another one is called Ahala. Gives you an idea of some of the gods here. There's another one called Brahma. There's several. And these are like D11. They call them D11 dark avatars. They're avatar collectives. D11, 11.5 at the highest level of them. That 0.5 they get from plugging into the Metatronic eye. Now, the lens of the eye of Metatron was only the beginning of what became a nightmare. It's a nightmare we've all been living. And sometimes there is a temporary reprieve in the reality of ignorance is bliss. We've been living that little space since 9558 BC. Kind of like let's take a breather and pretend we don't know anything. Since the 570 million years ago, since the Arimathea wormhole was created, a whole series of them were created to link through our gates into Phantom, to link the three together. There are also massive galactic wars, intergalactic wars, that were fought over this. There was a group of the original fallen ones in the Phantom Matrix that didn't want to go into the Weesadite Matrix. They didn't want to go into the Emerald Covenant either. So they were going to fight the Weesadeks. And they had members of their own that joined the Weesadeks. So it was splitting up of the races. There was a period of time called the Gaian-Orion Wars. And they took place 570 million years ago, right after the Arimathea wormhole was created, when there were massive wars fought in the Gaia system, which from here is Polaris, which is Earth's density 3 counterpart, and in the Orion system, where we have Stargate 8 in Mintaka Orion. There's also something called Alnitak and Alnilam Orion, and all of those systems with their various inhabited races in Phantom Matrix and in here and in Weesadek began to fight. The guys here didn't fight. They were trying to defend, because what was happening were the Weesadeks were coming through and they were seizing control of various of the Stargates in Phantom. They attached Metatronic lenses to Stargate 8 in Phantom Matrix, and that was Alnitak. They attached it to Stargate 10 in Vega. They connected one of their planets to the part of Vega that had entered Phantom Matrix. They worked themselves down from 11. They had at 11.5. They had their Aramat planet. They connected that to the moon in D11, the Avalon moon in Phantom. They connected next, that was D11, 11.5, and they connected the 10 systems, and they put a Metatronic, they called them seed atoms. They put Metatronic seed atoms, which were a series of lenses, into D10 Phantom Vega. Now the Phantom templates were created, a lot of them during the original fall, when Stargate 12 had been imploded through blocking Stargate 11. It had sent a portion into the Phantom imprint, which means reversal. It went into a reversed mathematical pattern, and they were all sustained by the Eye of Brahman that was put in. So, planetary system, dimensional system by dimensional system, the Weesadeks managed to create wormhole links through using this particular mathematics and crystal technology that were referred to as the Metatronic seed atoms, putting them in the stargates between Phantom and here. They linked through the halls of Amente before the halls of Amente were there. In fact, the halls of Amente were created later because of this. They were the natural stargates in our system. They began to seed them with the Metatronic atoms, which meant there is a bridge, that arc. They have their own Ark of the Covenant, and it's not a holy covenant either. They created arcs of frequency that would run from Weesadek Matrix through our stargates into Phantom. And eventually, what their ultimate goal was to do it all the way down from D11 all the way down to D1, link all the systems together, and then use the power to pull both of them into their matrix. So you could pull this time matrix down, literally break it off from its D12 connection at 11.5 at the Metatronic eye, and reverse its whole mathematical coding, and reverse phantom, and pull everything in them into the Metatronic imprint. That would be permanent if that were to happen. So of course the founders knew from the beginning that that was not going to be allowed to happen. There would be the sweep of the great cosmic cycle that would come through and open all of the highest gates and reset the D12 divine blueprint. What that would do would create a polarization wave that would separate anything that didn't belong in this divine blueprint originally and didn't have 30% of its original divine blueprint left because it had the Metatronic override, would be taken into the Metatronic system. It wasn't a choice the founders made to cause harm to the ones in the Metatronic system. The Metatronic races blame the founders for this. They take no responsibility for the fact that they're the ones that created this darn blasphemy of science themselves. They sealed their own destiny when they created the Metatronic distortion. And at this point, they are simply trying to feed on whatever's available. They've done an amazing thing. When I show you this one graph, it'll give you an idea of just the brilliance, I mean the intelligence level. You can be really intelligent and really stupid at the same time. But the sophistication of intelligence or intellect that these beings have to be able to take science. They're not just moving bodies around, they're moving galaxies around. They're moving suns. They're connecting suns to suns to suns through stargates. When you think about the level of intelligence that it takes to do that, and the level of knowledge it takes to do that, and then you think about us here, right now, it's almost laughable on the cosmic game. But there's an innocence about us, our race. That's what's going to get us through. But this is where it can almost get scary if we didn't know better. Now, if we know our direct connection, we know we have our D12 frequency available now, and if we amplify that in our fields, we get those Merkabahs built, we're going to be okay. We don't have to be afraid. But boy, is this one of those underdog games. You know, you see those dramas with the underdog, the little guy, the David and Goliath. Well, right now, we're dealing with self-appointed creator gods from a fallen matrix that have painstakingly, over a very long period of the illusion of linear time, created a technology. We'll get more fully into the technology tomorrow. It's known as the beast. And in the Bible, it's referred to as the beast, with 7 heads and 10 horns, etc., etc. That can't be undone once it's done. So the races, for this planet, as recently as Atlantis, had the ability to still bioregenesis out. Thoth made a choice. There was a very, very bad choice. Thoth was an Anunnaki who almost fully got back his Christos pattern. He made it to 11.5. And then he made a choice to join with the Weesadex, to lead his people into the Weesadex. And there was a small collective of Thothian high priests that knew. And the rest of the middle and low priests, the Templar Melchizedeks, weren't told what they were getting initiated into. They begin the fire sword initiations. The fire sword initiations, the flaming blue sword of Archangel Michael, which is a Nephilim collective of the Weesadex. It was a type of initiation where you'd go into a temple and you would say, yes, I give permission to have this immortal frequency run through me, without knowing what you were getting yourself into. And you'd get zapped. You'd get zapped with frequency that would be able to overpower your not quite, I mean, the Leviathan races weren't activated to 12th strand yet. They were just getting their 5th strand imprint when this mess began. And it took their 5th strand and it recoded it to the Metatronic pattern. And they would get juiced on that. You could get some real frequency flowing through you on that. But it was frequency that progressively took away the ability to ever regenerate the Christos pattern. Frequency that started a race line. It started the Leviathan race line in full as a master's invader race that was intended, and they were told to go forth and multiply. They were sent in to intermingle with our root races and our cloister races whenever possible, to send the Metatronic DNA distortion in to all of the race lines. So by the time the stellar activation cycle of this period came, everyone would have critical mass of Metatronic distortion. So we would help the planet to pull itself in to reversal, because so many of us were spinning unreversed Merkaba on the Metatronic pattern. Thoth went over in 22,326 BC. They wanted to finish it off then, but they weren't able to do it then because the founders' races blocked the stargates from activating any further. So they couldn't run Archangel Michael's flaming blue sword down through this. Because what this flaming blue sword is, it's that D7 plus D6 artificial D13 current that runs down the center pillar. It runs down our gate line, and it crosses over at the 6 points. Now, there's another diagram. We have those run off too, Lou? There's another diagram. This one's going to be hard to read because I didn't have time to white out a bunch of stuff we don't need. This was made from the one you've seen in the Dance For program that you're probably still trying to figure out what that means. You should be able to basically, if I point to things, you should be able to understand this. It would have been easier if we could have had, transparencies on this, but I'll just use this for now to show where the flaming blue sword of Archangel Michael comes through. Our grid's running basically where my 3 fingers are in the front there. One, I'm trying to, that one's running down this way. This one's the phantom axis. This one's running down this way. And this is our natural axis. I'll explain it if people over there can't see. Is there anybody, did somebody say they couldn't see? Okay. So these are basically the 3 axes. When we have the other diagram, when you see this one over here on the other diagram, that shows our main axis and then the 2 little axes coming in over there. There. There's ours. There's the phantom. And there's the Wisadek. Now, they link through the 6 gates. This is the 666. Phantom gate 6, our gate 6, and Wisadek gate 6. That is the crossbar, or the cross, of the flaming blue cross of Archangel Michael. That's where the frequency fully comes through and is able to go on the vertical and run from their matrices completely down ours, braiding this one and this one together through ours, and then pulling the whole thing over into that axis. It literally, through the hearts that were shown on this diagram, those hearts are like braiding machines. They're crystalline technologies that take 2 sets of frequencies and braid them together. And when the final heart starts beating, when that one is activated, the one down here at D1.5, that one will set in motion the braiding. Now, what we're facing in our contemporary times is the activation of the things called the turnstiles on the planetary level and on the galactic level that set in motion the coming of Archangel Michael's flaming blue sword. The trickery that's being done right now to people is one of the things that makes me, I still can get angry. I can understand their desperation. I can understand even how you can get so lost that you can actually blame someone else for your hologram, even though it's your own darn fault. But there's a trickery being done right now through several very, very popular New Age movements. They're taking people into initiations. Heck, Archangel Michael even has all sorts of centers set up. There's one in Sedona, Arizona that has this wonderful chamber to sit in so you can get zapped with the divine frequencies. They're doing the fire sword initiations again. What this does is activate in the human body the 2/3, part of which 1/3 is now dormant, like it's not turned on yet, but it's ready to go, of the Metatronic programming. It's the activation of the Metatronic programming. Once that programming starts to run through the body, our Metatronic shadow begins to take over the body. The Metatronic shadow is conveniently fused to a consciousness collective in the Silicate Matrix. We've got baggage. We have a shadow that was our own consciousness that was taken and put into reversal, that's been hanging out in our field. This is where we get the polarity within ourselves. One says yes, the other says no. One says I want to eat, the other says no, I don't. The one says I'm going to be good, the other says no, I'm going to be bad. You know, our duality, our chemical duality. Especially it's seen in exaggerated form with bipolar disorders, chemical bipolar disorders that people are suffering from. These are created because of the Metatronic programming that's partially imbued into our DNA templates and imbued into our Merkaba fields. Now we can override this until we have less than 30% of our templates left. The fire sword initiations that are being done right now among certain collectives, and it's not just the ones that use the name Archangel Michael. There's a lot of cover names, any of them that use Metatronic Science or Yahweh or any of those type of words. Any of them. They very often use the name Melchizedek, but they don't use the name Cloister. They will, though. Just wait. Yeah, be prepared. There's going to be an Azurite Templar style, Templar Melchizedek style. They'll have no choice because we're exposing them to the point where they have to look like they're one of us in order to get anybody. You know, I mean, it's not yet. There's a lot of people who very much hate the messenger here. And you know, that's too bad. They can make that choice if they want to. We have no need. The founders have no need. Source has no need to recruit anybody. But we made a promise a long time ago that regardless of how bad it got here, we would bring the truth back. And if nobody wanted to hear it, that was okay. They don't have to, because we respect the free will of all of the beings on this planet and every other one. But the Weesadeks and the ones who got involved with them, and many of the ones from the Phantom Matrix, don't respect free will at all. They're into dominion. They'll use trickery or outright aggression, whatever's necessary. Trickery is easier. It's easier to get somebody to go along with you than to force them to. If things were allowed to continue without a voice, a still small voice, with much less people than the other real popular movements that are on the circuit, you know, the international circuit really, but especially in the States, it would have been a breaking of our promise if we didn't come to at least set this information. It's like, okay, well, you guys can follow that, but here's this, take it or leave it. The free will is being honored, even if they hate us for it. And because of that, it's worth it. That's why we come and speak about it. I have nothing against the people, neither do the founders, that are into Archangel Michael, that are into Enoch, that are into the Bible, that are into this, that, and the other thing. Because at this point, all of the dogmas have been positioned since Atlantis to serve one of two agendas, neither of them the Christos agenda. There are two things happening, and there's a final conflict battle brewing. And it's not between the founders' races or the guardians' races. It's between the races of Phantom Matrix, who do not want to be assimilated, and the races of the Weesadek Matrix, the Metatronic Matrix, who want to assimilate them and us. Right now, there's a battle being staged. It was a battle that was really scripted out in Atlantis. We were kind of considered, the guardian races were kind of considered like they'd be hopeless by then. We wouldn't be able to do anything, so they didn't even really worry about us. We've caused them a bit of concern ever since we got the D12 anchored here, because now they're not going to be able to just do a smooth sweep through and take the whole matrix down. But there is a battle brewing, and we're beginning to see it. When we were given the information for Voyager's Volume 2, Second Edition, some things were explained to us about the contemporary drama. about the 9/11 event, September 11th event, how that was a trigger event that was meant to set in motion a certain number of other actions to follow that all are supposed to culminate into a fulfillment of a script that was made in Atlantis, this script being a World War III drama, through which a certain climate would be created that would be much more open for, let's say, visitors from the skies that came in as angels to tell us we can't destroy each other anymore. There's a presence needed on planet to run the HARP machines in the ways that our governments don't know how to run the HARP machines. We were given the technologies for the HARP machine and a few others like it because they plug in to this. They help download the Metatronic frequencies. We're preparing for a very interesting set of events. There's something that will be released for tomorrow. I don't know it, as doesn't know it. They didn't give it to us yet. It's on security release. Something has to do with May of 2003. There's a big charge around that time period. That's when certain groups of the ascended masters from the immortal, as opposed to eternal, life matrix, from the Wysidex, are forecasting the beginning of the fourth battle of Armageddon, 4 out of 7. The fourth being the one that's supposed to begin manifesting on Earth in 3D. We are going to be given information tomorrow, and we'll all get it about the same time. I might get it, as I might have it like half hour before you guys do. I don't know what it is, but I know it's probably pretty intense if they've not even given us a clue. There's some other things they did give us a clue about that we'll talk about tomorrow when we talk about the beast. Now this is part of the beast. This is what the beast is meant to drag us into and to finalize this creation, this Antichristos cube matrix, the Metatronic cube matrix. September of 2000, when the United Intruder Resistance was formed, because we got D12 here and they weren't expecting it, and it's the only way they could get anywhere was by joining forces. You now have what were 3 distinct scripts that were pretty straightforward as far as their events, blended into one, where they're taking a piece of this one and a piece of that one, and they're literally combining 3 programs that were programmed into the radio body of this planet. Each one of them programmed their own set of script into what digital hologram they would see here. Now it's being blended into one large script that has elements of the 3. So it's harder to track as far as exactly what's supposed to, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. But all of them had in common the final conflict battle, and all of them had in common the getting rid of undesirable elements of the population. Part of this has to do with the frequency fence that is progressively being built. That started in, September last year? It was September last year, wasn't it, when they started that? They let us know that, in fact, it was right before, the week before the 9/11 thing happened. They let us know that steps had been made, that the Illuminati agenda was advancing now, and they were beginning their frequency fence. And within a week, we had the 9/11 disaster and all that, and it was a trigger event to kind of mark the beginning. We're in the middle, or the beginning of the end, actually, of a drama that could get very, very weird as we move forward. We can expect, to some level, war. Now, what countries are going to be involved to what degree remains to be seen. The Middle East is going to keep going. It may die down a little. See, there's a way of playing with people, the masses, where it's almost like you cry wolf enough times, and then when the real thing is happening, nobody bothers to pay attention until it's too late, because they heard it so many times. They're desensitizing us right now to where we get to a point where we don't care anymore. Because, they're fighting again, whatever. There's going to be a point where we'll see some of this. We'll see certain things flaring up in one area, and our attention will be there and be worried, is it going to go to where? Oh, no, it didn't. See, they calmed down and they're not fighting anymore. Then it'll pop up over here. But eventually, in the next couple of years, probably it may be as early as 2003. I do believe somewhere around May of 2003, the next trigger event is going to be set in motion, and I believe that's probably going to be the United States and whatever it can get in its coalition going after Iraq. And that's going to set off some interesting things in the Muslim nations. Right now you're watching certain forces. I mean, now we have Christians and Protestants and Jewish people and Muslims and all these. If you look at countries, most of them are still at their core defined by a creed. Muslim forces being motivated to follow the script, to do their part in beginning the war. But you're also watching the Israelis be impulsed to do the same, and you are watching the other governments being impulsed to do the same. They're using ethics. They're using our belief systems, the things that are most dear to us, to motivate us to allow for horrendous actions to be permitted because we're being shown that there's not another choice. All of the things that we're seeing right now are part of the script that was electronically programmed into the planetary grids and the planetary radial body beginning in 25,500 BC. In 22,326 BC, it was all supposed to be done and over with, but the Guardian races intervened and they stopped the stellar activation cycle. It caused a partial pole shift, and it caused some cataclysmic earth changes on a smaller scale than have been before. But if that hadn't been done, none of us would be here to talk about it, and the whole place would have gone into the black hole matrix. At this point, we're doing better than we were in 22,326 BC. We could have been doing better than that if the Anunnaki had kept their agreements, but, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Doesn't do you much good. We are where we are. We're in Plan B, and Plan B has to do with becoming rapidly aware of the larger drama. We were getting aware of the big picture. Well, now we're getting aware of the huge picture, of where the big picture fits into. The huge picture, at its core, has Metatronics. When you hear the word Metatronics, it goes directly in hand with the Silicate Matrix. It is their mathematical coding, their hybridized, twisted mathematical coding, where they literally took creation mechanics and took portions of them. Like I explained before, if you had 12 subfrequency bands in each dimension, and you took half of this one, half of that one, half of that one, and knocked out 9 through 12, you could have a base 8 system that you could plug the other parts in and create an anomaly of physics that would allow for a frequency drawing current, or a sucking current, where it could tap into other matrices and draw frequency in and literally hold together a universal structure or a body structure that was artificially sustained. It's through an artificial light-sound pattern. Artificial in the sense that it was not part of the organic divine blueprint, and it's operating on twisted mechanics. We're dealing with this now. Our radial body of the planet was altered through this process, along with a lot of other places. Our physical bodies are carrying what is considered the shadow of Gaia. There's a reason it's called Gaia. It's because these things, the Metatronic coding that began to be filtered into our system, didn't begin with Earth or with this last period of Atlantean history. It began way before. It began during the Gaian Wars that we talked about, the Iran-Gaian Wars 570 million years ago. During those wars, they were an absolute mess. It was one of those, if you're going to keep a chalkboard, a scoreboard, the Weesadex got a big point on that one because they took out the Azurite races. The Azurite races were the original guardian races of this time matrix. It was because of that the Orifim guardian races had to be created, because, meaning taking out the guardian races, the Azurites, they literally pulled a portion of Gaia, which was Earth's density 3 counterpart, and a number of other systems, particularly in Andromeda and Procyon and some of the Sirius systems. Sirius C went down. There used to be a Sirius C. We have Sirius A and Sirius B right now. There used to be a Sirius C. They were all dragged down into the Silicate Matrix. The Azurite races had come into the Phantom Matrix. They had been sent into Phantom to try to help the Odedicron races to get out, because they were the ones that got stuck, the reptilian ones that got stuck, and they weren't even part of the drama intentionally. We had tried to get them out and to get any of the other races that wanted to do Emerald Covenant out of the Phantom Matrix when the Weesadex broke through. When the portions of Gaia and some of the other surrounding systems went down, large numbers, huge numbers of the Azurite races were taken down into the Silicate Matrix. Some of them got stuck in Phantom because the full Phantom Matrix didn't go down, only portions of it did. The ones that, the Azurite races that were sucked into Silicate Matrix were, once they were recoded to the Metatronic pattern, you can't get them out. So there were a large number of the original Ascended Master collectives that created the Azurites in this rescue mission that there are fallen entities all over the place because large numbers of them had gone down into the Silicate Matrix and were recoded. They became what was called the Azazel, which were a very dark race, and they look like the Azurite races as far as their physicality because they took the Azurite race genetic imprint and they assimilated it and put the Silicate consciousness in it. So we have a Gaian shadow in the sense that even from the period of the Azurite races, now what was created after the Azurite races 570 million years ago, about 568 million years ago, the Orophim were created. They took the Azurite pattern, the original Azurite gene code, and combined it and amplified it with more of the founders, Christos race's imprint. But by taking on the Azurite gene code, we adopted a portion of the pattern that had a vulnerability to be intercepted through the Silicate Matrix. This was done in part to allow healing to occur for the Azurite races that got stuck in Phantom, that hadn't completely fallen yet, because by bringing the Orophim in with that coding, we held their potential for bioregenesis, which means if you take an Orophim and you take an Azurite from Phantom Matrix and you combine them, naturally, you have them marry each other, and they have a baby. That baby is the beginning of a generation that is an advancement genetically compared to the fallen one before. And if you keep doing that, you build a race line. You can build a race line back up to what it originally was. So we took on, even in the creation of the Orophim that the humans here came out of, we took on a commitment to assist the fallen races, particularly the guardian races that had fallen into the Phantom Matrix. Right now, that genetic propensity that we've had has been abused to a very large degree. When it comes to our recent history in the third seeding of the humans on this planet, that genetic propensity has been amplified as far as crossing it with more of the Metatronic races. So each of us now carry a genetic legacy that is partly Phantom, which is a reversed coding. It's partly Silicate, which is a beyond the point of return reversed Metatronic coding, and the part of us that can get us through, which is the original divine blueprint that holds the imprint for everything in this time matrix. Angelic humans have the imprint of everything from D12 to D1 in this time matrix. The indigos, 1 and 2s, have everything from D15 on down for the indigo 2s, and everything from the primal sound fields on down, or the higher God worlds on down, for the indigo 1s that have 48 strands. On a personal level and on a race level right now, what we're dealing with is a shadow side that is genetically real. And it's the part of ourselves that's either going, what happens with our shadow is either going to make it or break it as far as which path of future evolution we end up on. There are some people that don't have 30% of their DNA templates, their original DNA templates left. They have been Metatronicked. They've had the fire sword initiations, which began in this particular line, in this particular seeding of the humans. It began in the Atlantean period after 25,500 BC, where certain groups, and these were begun with the Drac races, because the Dracs had actually gone over first. The Omicron Draconian races and their Leviathan races down here had gone over into joining, some of them had gone over into joining the Silicate first. So it began as a Draconian initiation. Then in 22,326 BC, it was actually 340 BC, right before that stellar activation cycle, when Thoth led his Leviathan races into Silicate contracts. That's when more and more races were subjected to the fire sword initiations, and then those races were forcibly combined with angelic human and indigo races, so the virus spread. So we all have, to some degree, the Metatronic coding. The Metatronic coding means that we can we are susceptible to frequency fence. Frequency fence is beaming through the planetary grid something that doesn't belong there, that can alter the way the brain and the body works in relation to consciousness. A frequency fence is like an interference pattern. If you think about electronics, what do they call those things? The jamming frequencies? You know, if you're sending like a radio frequency, there's another type of frequency you can send through that to break it up so the transmission doesn't get to the other end the way it's supposed to. Yeah, scrambler. Yeah. And just like when you try to get the cable picture but you haven't paid for those channels, you know, right? You pay for it, you get the, you can get the frequency through, but if not, there is a frequency fence that scrambles the coding. Well, the frequency fences that they use on a planetary level scramble the coding, the communication between the higher parts of your own identity and your 3D parts here. They scramble the operation between the brain and the emotions and the body and the spirit. Because we've all been subjected to some degree of Metatronic influence, we all have a susceptibility to that, even indigos. We all carry that with us. What it's going to culminate into is a path of the three paths of Genesis that are mentioned in the itinerary. There are three paths of evolution, and only three, because we are now in the heroic probability, which means the divine blueprint is being reset. That means all sorts of other things are going to adjust themselves accordingly. There are three paths that the human beings, and not just the human beings, but the plants and the animals and the minerals and the things you don't see that are two-dimensional, the elementals and things like that, that are going to evolve into. We have the path of Aramatena, which is the original D12 divine blueprint path of this time matrix. That is the path of freedom. It is a path of the Emerald Covenant. There is the path of Arimathea, which is the path of Metatron. That is a permanent path, because once the races make that shift, and it's like right now we have 2/3 of ourselves metatronically coded, but 1/3 is shut off. If you can recode back to its normal pattern, that half of that 2/3, so you only have 1/3 metatronic and you're back to 2/3 of your normal template, you will be able to not have your shadow drag you into metatronic alignment. But there are races now, there are beings on this planet, people we know, people we care about, animals we know and animals we care about, plants we like and plants we care about, that have too much of the Metatronic coding to undo in the short period of time we have left before the separation occurs. There's one path left for people who have at least 30%, or beings or things or planetary grids that have 30% of the original divine blueprint, is the path of the host, which means they won't be able to hold enough frequency in their bodies to make the full plug-in to their own divine blueprint. There are certain guardian races, Rishi and Ascended Master collectives, that are assisting. They're literally sending frequency alternatives. They will be hosted into other time matrices that they're more compatible with, time matrices that will preserve them from being taken in to the Silicate Matrix. This is going to look very strange as the three paths of Genesis come upon us. And they're Genesis because they are literally new species are being born now before our eyes through this change. The original species of the angelic human and the indigo will be regenerated. It will be regenerated, but it's new compared to what it was, because now it also has portions of the Metatronic coding, which means it has abilities to heal certain types of beings that are in a phantom type situation that aren't fully gone. So there have been things we've learned and things we've acquired as humans and as indigos that are different from our original creation. It's an expanded creation compared to what we originally started as. There's a new creation, and this is what the United Resistance, United Intruder Resistance, and the Wisedex, their whole focus is on. They are creating a new master race right now. They are creating it here on Earth. The people that are hijacked into full Metatronic coding will be a new race. They will be a race that has what used to be indigo children turned into magentas. The magenta races, are going to be the highest coded fallen races that have ever lived, because they have the indigo coding of, they have 12 strands. And they can go into what they're trying to do with the indigo races, turning them into magentas, is take them from a 11.5 strand reverse potential into a 12.5 strand reverse potential. Divine blueprints at D12. They're creating their own divine blueprint for their matrix, a reversed one, an antichristos one. There are people that many of us will know, people that hang out with Archangel Michael and a few other very popular speakers. Some of the people who follow traditional religions that since Atlantis have been distorted into something they weren't intended to be. These are the new bodies that the Metatron people are going to use to create their master race. However, a lot of the people in those bodies were the people that incarnated out of those matrices in the Phantom Matrix to begin with. So it's not as horrendous a level of victimization as one might think on the surface. On this planet, there's been a continual and progressive infiltration of the fallen angelic races from Phantom Matrix. And after Wisedet got involved, also from Wisedet Matrix. In the Atlantean period, the Leviathan races, which were originally a hybrid, I'll talk about them briefly in a minute, because some of you may not know what I'm referring to when I talk about Leviathan, and I will go over this page quickly, creation of the Leviathan. But in the Atlantean period, anyway, there was a huge influx of both fallen angelic souls from the Phantom Matrix and from the Wisedet Matrix, where a huge number of the people on the planet right now weren't originally human to begin with. Right now, they're wearing the mask of a human body, just like we are. What we call a human body right now is a mutation. This isn't what a human body looks like. A human body is much taller. It's much lighter in density. It's about, three times less dense than what we are right now. It has abilities of all sorts of things, like levitation and appearing and disappearing, Merkaba, and all sorts of things. What we've all been living is a shared mutation. That mutation was done, we have what's called the base 4 mutation, where we have 4 nucleotide bases that make up our base DNA. And this applies to plants and everything else on this planet. In the Atlantean period, between 25,500 BC and 9,558 BC, this mutation into an all-oneness, where we all wore the same faces so we couldn't tell each other apart anymore, that's when it was orchestrated. It was orchestrated for the purpose of meeting at this time, where you wouldn't be able to tell a human from a non-human. And we would all think, and we would all have our memories wiped to the point where we didn't know where we came from. We had different ideas that were fed to us from somewhere that ended up in books that, became things that people killed each other over, that kind of thing. So when we begin to see some of the changes that are going down, and we begin to realize that there are 3 distinct paths that people are falling into. What is 3? All right. The path of, that's the third one. Aramatena, Arimathea, and the path of the host, which is get you out of here in whatever way possible, because you can't make it into the path of Arimathea. We've got to get you somewhere so you don't go into the other path, basically. That's what that is. And that will be, there will be a lot of diversity in that. It will depend. All of us have different stellar coding. We have the same imprint as far as, human, or some of us that aren't human. Some of us came from other places, and we really are, we're sharing the human mutation, or the Homo sapien mutation, let's say. But we're not even, human. Some of us are other types of guardian races that we're working with the guardians of this time matrix. There's Syrians here. There's Lyrans here. There's all sorts of beings here that might not have even come fully through the Orifeme imprint. But they were able to pick it up in Atlantis, because it was a free-for-all in Atlantis with the genetic stuff they were doing. So that can be used to advantage as well. It'll be interesting as we progress in our personal development, because we'll find out who and what we are. Like we'll find out, well, gee, I guess I didn't do an Orifeme thing. Gosh, I'm like blue. I'm a Syrian blue. Yeah, that's an Azurite. Some people are Azurites. If you see yourself, if you start to get images of a blue Syrian as your Syrian self, where you're very tall and thin, and you have, many of you have no hair, but have very fine feathers, but very human-like faces, and very elegant beings. Some will even have wings. Some of them have, they're crossed with more of the Seraphi races, and they have feathered wings and things. Others are just blue hominids. Kind of like that Farscape show. The Farscape show, they have the blue lady. Yeah, well, we love watching that for her, because she's the way she looks is very, very close to certain races that came out of the Azurites. One of them are the Maharaji. The Maharaji are blue humans that are right now the guardian races of Sirius B, and they're also the ones that interacted with Hindu culture here, physically, at various times. They will be one of the races that we will eventually meet. The Iani will be first, because they look more like us and it'll be less traumatic, and then and they will assist us in getting to know the ones they work with, which are the Maharaji, which are the blue humans. But right now, we're in an interesting place, and that place, the main events that led us to this place took place in the last Atlantean period drama. In that drama, the script was written and programmed into the radio body. The script didn't finish running. It just started running in 22,326 BC when the guardian races shut the gates, which means they pulled the plug on the computer so the program couldn't run. Well, the plug is back in now. Fortunately, it's on a D12 current. It's like upgrading it from in the States we have 110 and 220 electrical current. I don't even know what it is in European countries. But we have an upgrade as far as the current running. But the program is still in the grids. It's still in the radio body. And it's a program because we're all connected to the planetary radio body. Our own radio bodies exist as part of the planetary radio body. It means there's going to be a script that begins running through our own radio bodies, which runs through our DNA, which will be a script on a personal level of impulses, feelings, sometimes thoughts. We never stop to think, I'm thinking, where did that thought come from? We assume it's ours. It's going to be a good time to become aware of the fact that not every thought that moves through your head belongs to you. Not every feeling that runs through your emotional body belongs to you. All right. Did you ever stand next to somebody who was having like a real bad day and you could just feel the negative energy coming off them, right? And did you ever find that you went home and a couple hours later you're just feeling really yucky? And you can't think of a reason why? You took on, through field resonance, some of the stuff that was standing next to you. You're processing through your own system. And the healers have a big problem with this sometimes if they don't know how to clear that out, because you will start to take on the scalar waveforms from other beings or things around you. Now, this can be done purposely as well, and this is how the script technology works. There's an interface with the human biosystem, with the Homo sapien biosystem, that allows the radio body programs that are being sent through Nibiru and through Wormwood from Wisadak to move through our systems, where it's almost like having an angel and devil on your shoulder, where you have one saying, I really like the Azurite teaching. It's like I can feel the freedom there. The other saying, no, that's evil. It's telling you not to like Archangel Michael. It's telling you not to like Jehovah. It can create, if you let it, this polarity in yourself that's very, very hard to rectify until you start asking yourself the question, where did that thought come from? Do I own it? Is it mine? Or am I having help thinking that thought? If we can realize we get a whole lot more help than we ever thought. And it's scary when you think about it. This is it's like soul rape, what's being done here, not to mention mind rape, because you're literally having something put things in your mind. It's like one of those horrid sci-fi movies that, they have a technology that will let them beam into your brain things that make you do what they want you to. They do have this technology, and it's being used here. It has been since Atlantis. But now is the final big hurrah in the game, when they turn on all the switches and all the programs. Now, if you're working with D12 frequency, and particularly if you're working with the Vecca codes, you'll progressively build an immunity to that, where you might start realizing that there's a weird space you can realize when you start to feel like, wow, it's like a CD is playing in my head. That's not mine. you'll start to find this whole cluster of ideas or thoughts, sometimes it's emotions, that, where in the world does that fit? And they're usually yucky, or they're meant to direct you in a certain way, and they really seem like they belong to you until you really stop your consciousness, get calm, and say, what is this? Where is it coming from? Do I own it? And really realize you might not. All right? I mean, once you realize you don't own it, then you have to own it, which means you have to say, okay, I'm not going to blame anybody for this. What am I going to do with it? Because the idea is to stop it from influencing you. The antidote to the radio body programming, which I call the CD in your head, is that's really what it works like. It's a CD that's operated off something called the Metatronic seed atom. And these are clusters of literally those, you know how we talked about the eyes, the lenses, the refraction polarization lenses? Well, these were built into part of our atomic structure here through the Metatronic mutations. So we have within our bodies a Metatronic seed atom that is the disc player. And it's through that we receive information from the radio body program that's running through the planetary grids. And it literally plugs into our personal little disc player and begins to run the CD. And it's like a CD-ROM in your head. There is only one antidote to that. If you can recognize that it's there, you need to do that before you'll realize you need an antidote. But it's not something you can rationalize with or reason with. It's not a part of your natural, even shadow self, that you're going to say, okay, well, I'll embrace you with love and I'll heal you. You can look at it as an electronic program. It's not going to respond to you as a person because it isn't a person. It's a program. It's energy. And there's only one way to not have that energy move through your system, and that's use energy in the right way to block that from being able to affect your system. That's where running the D12 and higher frequency and the natural mathematics that go with the body pattern, the Vecca codes and the Eka codes, that's where they all come in. These are the things that will give us the most protection from the Metatronic atom program. And we're all living with this. This is our Gaian heritage because it began with the fall of the Azurite races and the creation of races that had the Metatronic atom coding. And that's, if you want to look at the Metatronic atom, it's the seven spheres as opposed to the 15 spheres. They talk about the seed of life and those kind of things, which is the seed of the flower of life, those kind of things. They are built on the seven, and they form a particular type of Merkaba field. They form the bivecca Merkaba field, which is fine if you let it keep growing into its natural trivecca Merkaba that it's supposed to. But it's a phase-locked bivecca Merkaba that the bottom part of the bottom can't spin. This is part of what our Merkabas are doing right now. It's part of what the planetary Merkabas are doing right now, and it's part of what we're trying to overcome. Now, the history of the Atlantean mess, as I tend to refer to it, it's fascinating. There's a huge amount of detail. On this page, where it says creation of the Leviathan force and related history, this gives you a basic idea of a little bit of what came before, just a real rough rundown. We have 250 million years ago, angelic human seeding one took place on parallel Earth, and they were called the Palladorian cloisters. 25 million years ago, the 5 Palladian cloister races were seeded on Earth over here. So we've been here for 25 million years. 5,500,000 years ago, human seeding 1 on Earth was destroyed in the electric wars. 3,700,000 years ago, human seeding 2 was started. 848,800 years ago, human seeding 2 was destroyed via the 1,000 Years' War. And all of these wars, guess who they were with? It's like the same beings. It was the Anu Elohim and the fallen Draconian races versus the Emerald Covenant races. And it was all about Templar quest, which is territorial quest for the stargates. But it wasn't just stargates on one planet. It was stargates in this whole 15-dimensional time matrix that they were after. Now, 798,000 BC, we had the 5 Palladi-Urtite cloister races were seeded here. This was seeding 3, the beginning of seeding 3. You can read, because I'm not going to go into talking just about our seedings. What I want to do is get to the Leviathan races. Just know from 798,000 BC, that was the beginning of our 3rd seeding, and our races progressively, were put here, the angelic human and the indigo races. Then, there were a couple of other things that happened where between 669,000 BC and 250,000 BC, there were the Rama and the Templar Wars, and these were a mess. You had Anunnaki and Draconian invasions from all over. I mean, spaceship invasions. Things coming in with like sonic beams, photosonic beams that could make matter dematerialize when it got hit with it. I mean, big wars, that kind of thing. We had a race of pre-Leviathan fallen angelic hybrid things called the Nephidim. They were draconian, and another called the Urantia. These were Jehovian Anunnaki hybrids. These were the beginning of the Illuminati races. The Illuminati races were upgraded from this point and merged with something else. Now, that I'll talk about in a minute. In this period of the Rama and Temple Wars, the races, the Nephidim and the Urantia races, were not able to fully procreate with angelic human races. They were originally created through forced laboratory experimentation in some of the earlier seedings. And in some of the earlier seedings, in seeding 2, there was an experiment done, again, a bioregenesis experiment to try to help the fallen ones, that allowed natural procreation between the angelic human races and a certain small collective of fallen ones supposed to be not, wanting to get out of being fallen. And that turned into an absolute disaster. That's where we ended up with a seed race that went on, and they took it off planet. The fallen angelics took it off planet, and it became kind of like a core genetic template to upgrade their progressive building of a master invader race. Now, we learned our lesson in seeding 2, so we weren't going to do that again right away. And in seeding 3, the angelic human races and the indigo races were created in a way that they could not naturally hybridize, naturally procreate with any of the fallen angelic forces, which gave them protection from the fallen angelic forces. In 250,000 BC, there was a period of time where you had what are called the Pleiadian, Nibiru, and Anunnaki races. They're from Nibiru and from the Pleiades star system. These were the guys that in Sumerian history came down as Enki and Enlil and Marduk. Those gods. Yeah, they were gods. They were race lines that, when we get into the genealogies, that we won't get too heavily into today, but these were race lines of fallen angelic Anunnaki races. Some of them crossed with one thing, some of them crossed with another. The Enki, Enlil, and Marduk races, Anunnaki races, were considered, what do they call them? You had the Jehovian, there's a name, the Anu Seraphim. These were called the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki races. They weren't the original strain. The original strain were Anu Elohim, out of the Giovanni crew, and they were called the Jehovian Anunnaki races. The Jehovian Anunnaki races looked at themselves as the true, pure strain Anunnaki, and they didn't like the other ones. The other ones had crossed with various ones of the fallen Seraphi, be it draconian ones or some of the things that the draconians had created. So the Pleiadian Nibiruan Anunnaki races are Anunnaki races that have partial Seraphi or draconian type coding. You have the Enki, Enlil, and Marduk groups. What were the full names of those? They're in Voyages, Volume 2. The Enki Zephelium. Okay, Enki Zephelium races, the Enlil Odedicron. Okay, so if you look at the Enki Zephelium, now Zephelium were one of the fallen races that are connected to the Zeta races that we talk about now. And they were a reptilian snake type cross. Okay, so you took Anunnaki, which was a core Anunnaki, was an aquatic ape. All right, that was the original form. An aquatic ape hominid was the original Anunnaki form. So you take that and you cross it with, for an Enki family line, they would crossed it with the Zephelium. So it's Enki Zephelium. That's the Toth line. All right. Now Toth is a Nibiruan Anunnaki. He was out of the Enki family. Okay. Now Enlil crossed with Odedicron, so they call him the Enlil Odedicron. Now that would be a more reptilian, fully reptilian, as opposed to snake, more of a reptile, think salamanders and things. Okay. Then you have the Marduk group, which crossed with Omicron, which were the dragon moth people and the dinoids. So these are the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki races. And they've forever been trying to get the territory here. These are the ones that set up the Nibiru Datic crystal grid in 25,500 BC. But way back in 250,000 BC, they were coming in here speculating for various things. One of the things they were speculating for was gold, because they had depleted Nibiru's resources of organic gold. Now, they used gold in a very specialized way. They, through laboratory ionization, they call it, they create what's called, in contemporary terms, and it used to be called this in Egypt too, white powder gold, which is a substance that has the ability to create, let's say, electrical sparks within the atomic structure that allow more energy to be pulled in from the field around you, so it assists in sustaining immortal life. Not eternal life, but immortal life. There's a difference. You don't want to be immortal. Eternal, yes. Immortal, there are better things to do. But because they were running out of natural gold in their planetary system, and the Palladian system was devoid of it, it didn't have any to mine, Earth was very rich in organic, elemental gold. They literally, on Nibiru, once they created Nibiru in a way where it was in its artificial orbit, and it's an orbit that runs partially through the Phantom Matrix and then back up through our gates and into our system. It used to be in our system completely, but when it fell, they created an orbit that runs between the two systems, and every 3,657.8 years it cycles back through. So to sustain their atmosphere, they had literally changed their atmosphere, and you found a way to imbue this elemental gold ionized particulate structure into this white powder gold substance into their atmosphere, so they breathed it. And after many generations of that, it sustained the Metatronic body, is what it did. It helped to sustain the Metatronic body. After many generations of this, they couldn't survive without it. And there was all sorts of mutations happening on their planet with their peoples because they were running out of the amounts of gold needed to create this in the atmosphere. So they were on speculation journeys, trying to find places where they could rob more gold from. And this is where we got our original value of gold, actually, why it's so important. That was an Anunnaki trait. It's very important to the Anunnaki races because it helps them to sustain their immortal status in their bodies. And now that their bodies are mutated fully into the Metatronics, if they don't have some degree of that frequency that's created through white powder gold in their systems, they begin to rapidly deteriorate. Their physical forms rapidly begin to deteriorate, and their consciousness begins to fragment because they don't have a soul structure anymore that they're directly connected to. So in 250,000 BC, you had the Enki, Enlil, and Marduk, Palladian, Nibiru, and Anunnaki coming in and attempting to mine gold. And they started warring with each other because nobody liked to work the mines. And it was like, well, why should we work the mines? You work the mines. And they started to war with each other. So they decided to end that war amongst themselves. They were going to create a slave race, a slave race that would do the mining for them. And we were on the planet at the same time. The angelic humans and the indigos were. And we were in certain parts, usually associated with the Stargate and the Q-site locations. They were always our seeding grounds. And there are lots of raids by these guys trying to, grab humans and do things with them. But they decided to they didn't want something as intelligent as an angelic human, because you're not going to control it, basically. They wanted something a cross between an animal and something that had some degree of intelligence where you could put it on autopilot and it would do what you told it to. So they created a race called the Lulcus. They created the Lulcus by taking their own imprint, their aquatic ape hominid imprint, and combining it with the gene code, a small portion of the genetics of angelic humans that have been captured in their raids. And they did it in a laboratory. They created it in a laboratory, like our scientists are starting to play around now. And they combined it with the angelic human, their aquatic ape, and I believe